Hi, my name is Tamika Brown. I'm the director of ECMC's The College Place located in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm excited to share some really helpful information for students who are not U.S. citizens for how to best prepare for going to college here in the U.S. So this talk is going to talk about the Virginia Dream Act, which includes tuition equity. We're going to talk about the various financial aid options that exist here in the U.S., the different applications the students will have to complete to access that aid. Also, what's needed to actually complete the application, who needs to help the student to complete this application, and lastly, some tips and strategies that could be helpful for students who are not U.S. citizens as they pursue higher education here in the U.S. So first and foremost, we got to first acknowledge that the American higher education system is very complicated. It's very complex. And so it's important for parents and students who are not US citizens to have some idea of just kind of what this industry looks like, what this sector looks like on a very macro level. So please make sure when you're working with parents and students that they know the different types of post-secondary education that exist, that they understand credentials, certifications, diplomas. They understand two-year colleges can offer a workforce development training as well as general education courses that students can take to transition to a four-year setting. They should know the difference between undergraduate and graduate education and just kind of what degree comes from each one of those particular settings. They should understand what professional school is and how that differs from an undergraduate education. So it's important to kind of lay the foundation of what all of that looks like, so that they know that as a high schooler who is applying for college, what options make sense for them, and then what options make sense in terms of planning for the longer scheme of their educational plan. It's also important for folks to know college costs and how to pay for college. In this talk, yes, I'm going to provide information about financial aid and the financial aid applications. But in the US, funding for students who are not US citizens is hard to come by. So I want to share some information in a minute about some funding that students in Virginia have access to if they've been here for 2 years and graduated from a Virginia high school. But I'll also share some resources later on that and communities that's been helpful in helping students who are not US citizens to prepare for paying for college and collegiate success. It's important to understand the timeline for planning. How early should they start and in what ways should they start planning? It's helpful to know that financially planning for college should start at birth and how families should work to kind of to donate, well, not donate, but to pay into savings to help offset some of those college costs if they're able to after a student graduates from up until the time students graduate from high school. And then the process for applying and being admitted to college, helping parents to understand that August is when college applications become available. And so that's probably the earliest that they would need to complete an application, helping them to understand the admissions deadlines, understanding the difference between early decision, early admissions, regular decision, and even rolling admissions is going to be helpful. And then the different parts of an application that a student will need to submit in order to submit a completed application and be considered for admissions to the school. So these are a lot of the intricacies that families have to understand or will need assistance in understanding if they're not used to understanding the Virginia higher education. So there are some US citizens who may not even understand. Most US citizens, I would be willing to say, may not understand the ins and outs of this process. But if we're working with families and students who are not US citizens, it's helpful for them to kind of get a lay of the land before they jump into completing a college application. So to understand college costs, it's important to know what the cost of attendance is, of the COA. Every college and university in this country comes up with the average cost they believe the average student would need in order to be successful at that school. And that COA could include quite a few different things. Some things students pay directly to the school, and others, they have a bit more agency and independence to determine kind of how they're going to spend or how they're going to use those particular budget line items to be prepared for college. Be prepared for success that year in college. So tuition is what students pay essentially for going to the school, taught by the professors, being taught using the facilities. That's tuition. Fees, again, along the same lines, require fees that go with kind of the administration of the college. Next, room and board, which is changing to meals and lodging. meals and housing, excuse me, meals and housing. But essentially, room and board is what students pay to live and to eat as college students. So if they live in a dorm or have a meal plan, then they'll pay their room and board expenses directly to the school. But if they live independently, live at home, live off campus with roommates, then those meals and housing expenses are included in the cost of attendance. Books and supplies are essentially the material that students need in order to take the class and be successful in the coursework. The school may report one number for books and supplies, but depending on what the student's major is and where they choose to source those materials, it determines how much they'd actually spend in those particular areas. Also, transportation. Transportation varies from student to student depending on how close they live or how close their home is from their school of choice, and also how close where they live is from their school of choice. Meaning, if a student lives off campus or live in a city where they're going to a school that's in their city, they have to think about how they're getting to and from campus every day. But again, a school will report one number for transportation expenses. Also, personal expenses we know vary from student to student. But I encourage families to recalculate these budget line items that you don't pay directly to the school. These indirect costs have a more accurate number that would more accurately reflect what your expenses may be to go to these schools. What will your books and supplies be? What will your transportation expenses be? How much will your personal expenses be? And then use those numbers to calculate what the cost of attendance is. In most cases, students tend to spend a lot less than what's reported. Also, studying abroad can be included in the cost of attendance. Students can work with their financial aid administrators to include that. And also the cost of a computer purchase can be included. But again, all of these things can be included. Students are only responsible for paying the direct cost directly to the school. And I think it's important for students, families who are not U.S. citizens, to understand just kind of the cost of attendance, knowing what direct costs are or indirect costs, and knowing what particular areas they have control over. The Virginia Dream Act, which I mentioned a moment ago, is the act that came into place a couple years ago in July. Essentially, it was for tuition equity. What does this mean? If a student meets the following criteria in the state of Virginia, they are eligible to pay in-state tuition at public colleges and universities here in the state. So to qualify for tuition equity, which is in-state tuition, students must have attended a high school in Virginia for at least 2 years. They have to have graduated from a Virginia high school or have a GED by July 1st of 2008. And if they are dependents, their parents must have at least 2 years of income tax return, state income tax return in the state of Virginia prior to the date of college enrollment. So if a student meets all these 3 criteria and, of course, enroll in a public school here in the state of Virginia, then they will qualify for in-school tuition, in-state tuition for any public school in the state of Virginia. Those students also qualify for in-state grants. Now, historically, students who are not U.S. citizens do not qualify for any public grant funding, federal or state. But many states have decided to create processes and applications that will give access to their state grant funding to students who are not U.S. citizens, but who also reside in their states. And Virginia is following the trend now by making state grants available to non-U.S. citizens who are in the state of Virginia through the VASA application or VASA application, VASA. I'll talk more about that in a second. But if a student meets the criteria for tuition equity, they qualify for all of these 6 grants that you see on the screen if they complete the VASA. So the first grants are for students who are considering public schools here in the state. So they'll be students who are not U.S. citizens will have in-state tuition and will be able to be considered for these public grants. The Virginia Commonwealth Award will award a student up to $4,000 to contribute to their college costs, and it is need-based, so it's based on the family's ability to pay for college. Virginia Guaranteed Assistance Program, or VGAP is what we call it. VGAP is a program that is both need and merit-based, and students can get awarded anywhere between $3,100 and $14,000 to offset their college costs. It is not unheard of for a student to be awarded Virginia Commonwealth Award and VGAP at the same time, but it's important to know that VGAP requires a student to have a 2.5 GPA when they're in high school, And then this grant is renewable renewable while they're in college as long as they maintain a 2.0 GPA. They also have to prove that the family has need. That's based on the student's SAI, the Student Aid Index. Next, the Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Education Program incentivizes students who, the Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Program is a program that provides a full tuition waiver for students who are survivors of U.S. servicemen who were Virginia residents, but unfortunately passed during deployment, or they are dependents of U.S. servicemen that are at least 90% disabled as a result of military service. Those students receive a full tuition waiver to attend any college in the state, any public school in the state of Virginia, and living stipends to handle those indirect costs that they're not paying directly to the school. Next, the two-year college transfer grant program is the program that incentivizes students who want to attend a Virginia community college for 2 years and then transfer to a 4-year setting. Those students who have a 3.0 GPA and an SAI that's less than 12,000, meaning federal student aid has determined that their family can contribute up to $12,000 or less towards their college expenses. Those students get a $1,000 grant to transfer to a public school in the state, and that grant is renewable for an additional year. Lastly, the only grant on the list of public grants that don't require FAFSA completion is called the Workforce Credential Grant. This grant goes to fund a lot of the workforce development programs in the state now through VCCS, which is the Virginia Community College System. So this program funds programs like Fast Forward and G3 that provides funding for in-demand career areas around the state. So a lot of these programs, if students come from their family and the family income is less than 100K, the program is funded at 100%. In a lot of cases, they receive a stipend for even completing the program. So it's a great opportunity for students who are interested in those short-term credentials, 6 to 12-week training credentials. And most of them are almost guaranteed a job because they're based on careers that are in demand in their particular regions in the state. So the Workforce Credential Grant is a great opportunity for the right student. I encourage them to look into it and see if any of the programs are available, aligned with their interests, and then jump into it. Next, the one grant that's available for students interested in private education in the state of Virginia is VTAG, Virginia Tuition Assistance Grant. This grant awards any Virginian or non-U.S. citizen who's been in Virginia for 2 years $4,000 to contribute to their private school education as a Virginian. Next, it's important for folks to know that colleges and universities have the ability and do award institutional funding. It comes in the form of grants and scholarships, and it's important for students who are not U.S. citizens to understand what grants and scholarships are versus a loan. They need to know that that is free money and that colleges and universities, as well as the state of Virginia, offers free money to help them offset the cost of an education. But with the colleges and universities, it's important to iterate the fact that colleges create their own awarding criteria. The federal government, neither does the state, control how colleges award their institutional funding for financial aid. So just know that they create that criteria, but do know that they indeed award institutional aid. Also, scholarships are available. Again, scholarships is free aid, gift aid that students receive to contribute to their college costs. They pay nothing for it. And there are scholarships available on multiple different avenues, through their high school, through their community, through their colleges and universities, through institutional funding that I just mentioned. And there are a lot of national scholarships that exist. It's important, though, for students to give attention to the applicant pool that they are the most competitive in. And in most cases, it starts with their high school. There are many students who like to run to the national scholarships because they tend to give a lot of money. But we encourage them to start with the applicant pool where they're most competitive, and that's their high school, because they're competing against other members of their senior class that actually apply for the scholarship. A lot of students don't know this, but there are community orgs and civic groups that reach out to their high school specifically and say, we want to give scholarships to graduating students at this school. And in that case, students are only competing against other members of their school who actually apply for the scholarship. And so it increases their chances of actually winning it. Now, I don't discourage them from applying to national scholarships, but I do encourage them to think about how competitive they are in that applicant pool. How competitive are you? If you complete these 6 essays, are you Do you stand shoulder to shoulder with a kid who wrote a book, or a kid who did extensive science experiments? I don't discourage students from applying for national scholarships, but just think about how competitive you are, and if it's worth your time to complete those applications or those essays if you're not competitive in the applicant pool. I'm always asked, what are some scholarship search engines that we should look on, or places that you should recommend us to look? Well, here's a list of some of the legitimate scholarship search engines that exist. We encourage you to use them, create accounts, move around, find scholarships around them, but be mindful, a lot of them tend to have the same scholarships over and over again. So if you have an account with a couple, you're probably fine. Also, be mindful, no matter how well these sites are vetted, there are still people who are going to create scholarship entries that are not, or scholarship entries in these spaces that are not legitimate, that are scams. So we encourage you to be thoughtful, mindful, use wisdom as you move through these scholarship searches. If they ask for money, then it's probably a scam. If they ask for your banking and credit card or debit card information, it's probably a scam. But if it's ever a question, reach out to a trusted adult. Reach out to us at the College Place, folks at your programs, at your schools, to ask them to look into the legitimacy of a scholarship program if you're questioning whether or not it's something that you should lean into. But yeah, again, use wisdom as you move through those spaces. So now we've talked about all the different types of financial aid that is available to students who are not U.S. citizens. Let's talk about how they can access that aid. Well, the first is the free application for federal student aid, and that application should only be completed by U.S. citizens, by non-U.S. citizens if they are applying to private schools outside of the state of Virginia to be considered for aid. If they are applying to those private schools, and they should only list those private schools on the FAFSA. I'll talk about that more in a minute. The Virginia Alternative State Aid Application, or the VASA, is the app that I've mentioned quite a few times before that gives non-U.S. citizens access to the 6 state grants that are available here for higher education. And also the CSS Profile is a platform created by the College Board to capture additional financial information about the family. Schools that require the CSS Profile tend to have a lot of money. They want to make sure they're giving it to the right student. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And then lastly, scholarship applications. Students must complete the applications to be considered for scholarship aid. No one is just going to find them based on their exceptionally high GPA or great SAT and ACT scores. No, students have to seek out these scholarships and actually apply for them to be considered in order to be awarded. The FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, is a gatekeeper for most financial aid in this country. Now, this application is usually completed by U.S. citizens to be considered for federal financial aid and state financial aid if their state does not have a separate application. But for students who are not U.S. citizens, they use this application differently. Because these students don't have access to any federal financial aid, they're still using the actual platform, this application, to present their family's financial information to a private college or university outside of the state of Virginia so that they could be considered for aid. Private schools do not receive public funding, so they're able to use their funding that they have through their endowments for any way they see fit. And many of them provide competitive financial aid offers to students who are not U.S. citizens that they have offered admissions to. So if you must complete the FAFSA because you're interested in a school outside of the state, just be sure not to list any Virginia schools on the FAFSA application. Only list Virginia schools on the VASA. State schools have been directed to prioritize the FAFSA over the VASA. So if a non-U.S. citizen lists a Virginia school on the FAFSA, that means they will not be considered for state aid that may be eligible through the VASA. So long story short, if you're applying to private schools outside the state, complete the FAFSA. Don't list Virginia schools. If you're applying to schools in the state of Virginia, only complete the VASA. To complete the FAFSA online, there are certain, one, you have to create an FSA ID, but I want to take a moment to kind of address that there are a certain population of folks who are not U.S. citizens, but still qualify for federal aid. A lot of times we assume that no non-U.S. citizen will qualify for federal aid, and that's not true. There are a couple classes of folks who still qualify. So to qualify for federal aid, you have to be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national, have a green card, have an arrival or departure record, have battered immigrant status, or have a T visa. If a student has any of these, or they have a parent with a T1 visa, then these students qualify to both complete the FAFSA and be considered for federal financial aid, in addition to the state aid that's going to come as a function of them being residents in the state of Virginia for 2 years. So FAFSA completion tips for non-U.S. citizens. Well, non-U.S. citizens should complete the FAFSA, as I said a minute ago. And this just lays out the point that I made earlier about choosing the FAFSA or the VASA and how to go about actually completing the FAFSA. They should complete the FAFSA if they're applying to schools outside the state of Virginia that are private. Just be mindful that they qualify for tuition equity as well. So it's definitely advantageous to consider schools in the state of Virginia, particularly public schools in the state of Virginia. Students and parents, if they're dependents, must have an FSA ID. And this year, they're making it necessary for students and parents, even if they don't have a Social Security number or a 10 or an I-10 or an alien ID number, to still create an FSA ID. They're creating a process for that, and we'll make that information available as soon as federal student aid tells us. But they're in the process of determining a process for those parents and students to create an FSA ID to complete the FAFSA online if they don't have a temporary Social Security number, alien ID, or an I-10. But I say folks can apply for an I-10 online. They can go on the IRS website and apply for an I-10 so they can get an FSA ID. You don't need to be a U.S. citizen to apply for an I-10. The paper FAFSA is available for those who don't necessarily want to jump through the hoops of an FSA ID, but we anticipate this option becoming obsolete within the next year or two. So we want folks to get used to going through the process of completing the FAFSA online if they can. Lastly, I cannot overstate this. Do not list any Virginia schools on the FAFSA. If you list any Virginia schools on the FAFSA, they will not consider you for any Virginia state aid. You can only list Virginia schools on the VASA to be considered for those 6 state grants. As I mentioned earlier, I said many a times about the Virginia Alternative State Aid Application, the VASA. The VASA, again, gives non-U.S. citizens access to the state's 6 state grants. The criteria for the VASA is the same as the criteria for tuition equity, which I explained earlier, but just be mindful that these 2 steps have to be completed. They have to complete the VASA, and if they're applying for private schools outside the state, they have to complete the FAFSA. And both of those steps have to be completed for them to be considered for financial aid in these respective institutions. If students are confused about what application they should complete, I created this kind of flow chart to help them figure out what makes sense. What application should I complete based on my citizenship status, based on the schools that I'm considering applying to? So this chart can be really helpful for both U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens to figure out what application should they complete. But just in general, the FAFSA and the VASA have the exact same questions. They ask about student demographics. Who are you? Where you want to go to school next year? What type of degree are you pursuing next year? And then they also ask for income and asset information from both the parents as well as the student. If the student is a dependent, they ask for the information from the student as well as the parent, as well as opportunities for electronic signatures. The other application that I mentioned earlier for financial aid is the CSS Profile. This is the platform created by the College Board to capture additional information, financial information about the family. One thing I say over and over again, schools that require the CSS Profile have deep pockets. They got a lot of money, but they want to make sure they're giving it to the right students. Most of these schools meet 100% demonstrated need. That means if a student has need as demonstrated by the FAFSA, so they've completed the FAFSA and then their SAI shows that the family has need, then most of the CSS Profile schools will meet all of the need, but they have to go through this hurdle of completing the CSS Profile and listing the school on the FAFSA or VASA, depending on which application it makes sense for the school that you're applying to as a non-U.S. citizen. Things that you should know, these are the schools that require CSS Profiles. Last year, we anticipate this list staying the same. But it's important to know if a school you're interested in is listed here, then you have to complete a CSS Profile and you have to list the school on the FAFSA or the VASA if it's a Virginia school. So just as something to be mindful for. But if you are not mindful of, but if you are not applying to any schools that require the CSS profile, you'll know because it's usually listed on the school's admissions page or the school's financial aid page. But if you're not interested in any schools that require the CSS profile, ignore this information, ignore this advice. It's only for schools that require it. If your school does not require it, you do not need to complete it. You can just ignore it, act like it doesn't exist. Other things to know about the CSS profile. It is not free to submit. With the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, it costs nothing to complete that application and submit it. Well, the CSS profile costs $25 for the first submission. So that's the first school that you have to send the profile to. And then $16 for each additional school that the student sends the profile to. But if a student qualifies for free fee waivers through the College Board, through like the SATs, then they can get fee waivers for the CSS profile and not have to pay for those submissions. Also, things to note, the FAFSA asks for a certain set of financial information, and CSS profile is going to ask for additional information, to include information about the non-custodial parent, and that information is not required for all students on the FAFSA. It may be required for some, but not for all students. Also, other additional income and asset information, like the value of the home in which the family lives in, which is not required to be reported on the FAFSA. So just find out if the schools that the student is interested in requires a CSS profile. If the answer is yes, then go through the process to make sure they understand what's necessary and kind of a timeline for that. But if the schools do not require the CSS profile, then move on with the FAFSA or the VASA. Additional recommendations for non-U.S. citizens. Begin with the process of paying for college in mind. I know that's tough because generally we start to think about preparing for college and figuring out the school we want to go to, which is backwards. We probably should think about the career that we want. But for students who don't have access to a lot of financial aid, and particularly non-U.S. citizens who don't have access to federal financial aid, you have to think about paying for college in mind. So you have to start this process thinking about how you can afford the college tuition in light of what aid may be available from the state and what aid may be available for the respective college or university. So the families have to consider what they can pay towards that process and build out a college list. Build out a college list with that in mind. Also, determine the path for paying for college. Determine what makes sense. When should they start? If the student wants to work, if they're working, how should they be saving money? How should they go about applying for scholarships? When should they be completing the actual financial aid applications? That's what we mean by a path. Knowing when is the appropriate time to complete these applications. You shouldn't be completing them 2 years earlier than what's necessary. So figuring out the exact path or timeline for paying for college. Also, be aware of opportunities to get college credit in high school so that students aren't paying as much to complete college credits once they actually enroll in college. Students have the opportunity to do dual enrollment while they're in high school, which is taking college classes at their local community college or at their high school taught by community college professors. And in a lot of cases, these credits are considerably less expensive than those that have to take on a college campus. But just make sure you're taking classes that are transferable and that you are doing well in those classes. Once you take a class with college credit, that's it. That's a college transcript. So you want to do your best in these classes because this transcript is going to follow you through college or graduate school if that's what you pursue. Be mindful of the awesome opportunities available through Virginia colleges. Through the VASA, students now have access to six state grants that they did not have access to 2 years ago. So please, please, please give Virginia schools some serious consideration because of the amount of aid that could come from a family this high need. Also, lean into private colleges and universities. As I mentioned earlier, many of them offer financial aid or consider students for financial aid who are not U.S. citizens. So lean into private colleges, not just in the state of Virginia, but all over the country, because they're not held to this. They don't receive public funding, so they don't have to kind of follow the same rules as public schools. Also, a lot of students have used strategy. They've gone to community college first and then transferred to the private college or university. In Virginia, they could use VASA funding to go to a community college, and then they get good grades and then transfer to a 4-year school after those 2 years. let me put you on the game. So what we found is that a lot of schools want to offer competitive financial aid statements offers to many students, but they just can't afford to do it. So there are some students who they can offer a full 4-year ride to, but then there are others who they can only afford to offer them 2 years. So we've noticed that some of the students who are not U.S. citizens who go to community college and really walk out with a really strong GPA, they get full scholarships to complete their bachelor's degree at a 4-year school. So look into that avenue. Really, it's an affordable way to get a college degree. Starting at the community college, get really strong grades, using some of that Virginia state funding for that, and then transfer to a 4-year school where you can access a more merit-based aid to finish that bachelor's degree. Lastly, connect with the dreamer community. There's a huge community of folks throughout this country who are not U.S. citizens, but who are aware of just kind of the challenges and want to be able to make resources and information accessible to other U.S. citizens throughout this country. So touch base with the Dream community, join it. That space shares a lot of information about going to college, about career attainment, about financial aid, about scholarships. So please, I encourage you to really tap into the Dream community and the wealth of resources that are available there. Help when you need it is available. You can reach out to your high school counselors for support in completing a VASA or support in preparing for colleges as students who are not U.S. citizens. You can also reach out to us at the College Place. We're here to help anyone for free. We just really want to be of support. So if you have questions or if you need support in this process, please, 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 please don't hesitate to let us know. Also, you can reach out to Federal Student Aid directly, or the College Board has a plethora of resources through their Big Future platform that could be useful as well. So I hope this talk was useful. I hope it gave you insight into this, the preparing for college process for a student who is not a U.S. citizen, but interested in the American higher education system. Please reach out if ever we could be of support. We know preparing for college can be complicated and confusing, frustrating, even discouraging in some spaces, but we're here to help. So please, please, please reach out in any way that we could be of support to you. By all means, we're here to help. So thanks so much for your time. You can reach out to me via the email address you see there or the phone number you see on the screen. Have a great rest of your day.